Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are joined by Kelly O'Connor McNees to present The Myth of Surrender. What if the most important decision in your life was not yours to make? Kelly is joining us tonight to talk just about that and her new book that features the baby scoop era, which is a terrifying time in history to me as a mother. I can't imagine going through what these women went through. So good evening, Kelly. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So why don't we start off with you giving us a little synopsis of The Myth of Surrender.
Yeah, so The Myth of Surrender is a novel about two young women who would not have met any other way, except that they both wound up pregnant and were sent away to a maternity home in downstate Illinois, and they were assigned to be roommates based on their due date, which is how that was done. Maternity homes during this era were very secretive places, and privacy was a big selling point of them. People didn't use their real names. They were assured that they could go and stay for the duration of their pregnancy, have the baby, and then go back to their life as if nothing had ever happened. Of course, we can imagine anyone who has a child or has thought about having a child or even is a child or once was a child can imagine that that is not really how things went for most of the women that went through this experience. I was very interested in this era, which I didn't know. I knew a little about, but I didn't know that much about it, and was surprised how few people I talked about it with had ever really heard about it or knew about it, unless they had firsthand experience or someone in their family that they knew had gone through it. And so that was sort of the starting place. And I had this friendship in mind as a way to examine that era. And so that was sort of the beginning of the book. And the story just follows them through their pregnancy, through the experience of being in this home. And then what happens afterward. We meet them again years later to see what has happened with their lives since. Oh, I can't hear you, Samantha.
So you talked a little bit about it,
Mm-hmm.
but what brought you to actually sit down and write this story?
Yeah, so I know someone who went through this experience a long time ago. And so because I knew her story, I had in mind a little bit about, I've always had curiosity about it. But it was about 4 years ago, I came across a collection of oral history interviews with birth mothers who had lived in maternity homes across the country and some in Canada as well. And there was a researcher in Rhode Island who she herself was an adopted child and had always been curious about her own birth mother. Learning about her origin, she really felt that the stories of these birth mothers were really a missing piece in helping us to understand this era where there was so much closed adoption and records were completely sealed, and what that experience was like. She knew what that experience was like on her side, but she had a lot of questions about what it was like for the women. So she put out a call thinking it would be hard to find women to talk to her because it's so secretive. But actually she was just flooded with like hundreds and hundreds of emails, people who were willing to talk about what had happened to them. And so she went around interviewing people and collected those in this book. And I somehow came across this book. I might have known about it a little bit and sort of sought it out. I don't really remember exactly, but came across my path. And as soon as I read, it was just so heartbreaking. And there's something about oral histories where it's a first person interview and it's the women talking in their own first person voice about their experience. Of course, decades had passed, so they also had the benefit of hindsight and looking back on that time in their life with the wisdom that they had as an older person. It was interesting too, and how it's changed. There was a lot of bitterness, thinking if this had happened to me 20 years later, if I had been, born at a different time, I might have had a totally different experience. So all those things were just very fascinating to me. And there were so many, for every woman, it was a unique story, her background, the way that she felt about what happened to her, how she was treated, how she made meaning out of what had happened to her, whether she had peace about it or did not have peace about it, what questions, whether she had reconnected with the child once the child was an adult or not, and there was all range of experiences that you can imagine were represented in those interviews. And so I just thought, how do you write about an era that involved 1.5 million women? You can't tell every story, but what fiction can do and what historical fiction can do allow us to see through the eyes of one person, or in the case of this book, two narrators, and the story back and forth between their voices. That can be a window that we can't cover everything, but we can go in depth on one experience and really put ourselves in the shoes of another person, which is what I love about reading fiction and what I try to do in writing it.
That's beautiful. So obviously this took a lot of research to put this story together. Was there any particular rabbit holes or stories that really stuck with you during this time?
It's not that long ago in time. If we think about the baby scoop era is loosely defined as the end of World War II, so 1945 to the passage of Roe v. Wade in 1973. And during that era is when there were hundreds of these homes across the country, and conservatively 1.5 million women stayed in these homes and surrendered babies, probably way more than that, because there are lots of informal, it was very decentralized. It wasn't like there was one national organization running these. They were run by Salvation Army and different, Florence Crittenton is another one, different organizations across the country, local dioceses. And so there are now really good records, for us to know for sure how many people. But yeah, I think that it's hard to wrap our heads around how different culturally things were, even though it's only a few decades ago. The secrecy and the privacy really struck me, that the most important thing was to keep your identity secret. And that was sort of the selling point that was given to the parents of the pregnant girls, that, our maternity home can take care of this problem for you, so that this thing that happened to your daughter will not impact your social standing in the community, will not put your economic or class status at risk. We're going to make this go away. And so first of all, the fact that nobody was asking the young women if that was what they wanted or how they felt about that. They really weren't even part of the decision. But also there was not concern about their own psychological experience of that secrecy and how that would be very damaging for them. And of course, we know a lot more now about psychology and trauma and how these things work and how these things last over a lifetime. And people maybe didn't understand that so well, but it's just very interesting to notice that the emphasis was on, the appearance, what would, that no one would have to know that this happened. There was a real story because the girls were not allowed to use their real name. And they had, a lot of times they made up a fake story about, they told their friends at home that they were off taking care of a sick relative or something like that, had a excuse for being away from school. And then to the girls that they met in the home, they would maybe not tell where they were really from or something like that. But there was a story in the oral histories of two girls who had been in the same maternity home at the same time, and they were both from different towns. So it was somewhere out of town. But then they somehow ended up at the same college the next year, just by coincidence. And they were walking down the paths on campus and they saw each other. And they didn't know each other's names or anything, but locked eyes and recognized each other. And then just kept walking because they knew they couldn't acknowledge, that they had both been there. So you asked about moments that really stuck with me. That was one. And I think in a way, I don't have that moment in my book, but that was sort of what I was thinking about with these two characters of how to have this really powerful experience with each other that no one who hasn't been through it can understand, but you have this bond with a complete stranger, and then you can never talk to them again. I just thought that was a really amazing thing to imagine.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. Like that's got to be very significant in their life story as well. I know you have some photos
Yeah.
prepared. Do you want to share those?
Sure. Okay, let's see if I can do this without breaking everything. All right, can you see that? Yay. Okay, so this is sort of in no particular order, some things that I think are interesting that I came across in my research. These are sort of places where I've seen maternity homes mentioned in newspapers. I was paying attention, because they were so secretive, I was curious about how would they have been advertised? How did people find out about them? I think it was mostly word of mouth, and girls would be referred by their priest or something like that. But a lot of times there were articles about fundraisers, and I think there was a lot of curiosity in the public about what went on, behind the closed doors. I mean, there was really a narrative around, these places were a safe haven that you could go to hide, and not be shamed. But this is an example of a headline that, and I don't think I had the date, I didn't record the date, but I would guess this is 50s, late 50s maybe. The Unwed Mother in a Booth Memorial Home, there were several of those across the country. You are neither condoned nor condemned. And I just thought that was very telling because, there was a lot of concern about we have to have a place for these girls to go, but we can't make it too nice. We can't make it like a vacation and where, people are going to be too nice to you and not shame you, because of course we have to, we
Right,
won't
it shouldn't
condemn
be a
you,
place
but
you want to go.
right, exactly, because they probably thought somehow that there would be like a trend of girls one. I don't know what they were afraid of, but just interesting. So, okay, so I'm going to go to the next one. So these are just some interesting stories from the newspaper. So here's one home from Detroit, and these are obviously publicity photos, but we've got a very nice nurse or nun opening the door, and here's your house of another chance. We've got the nurses or nuns, it could have been either, holding these babies on the stairs. So look at all these babies. And I haven't even said much about this, but of course, one side of the equation are the girls with the unplanned pregnancies and they need somewhere to go. But the other side of the equation is the demand for babies by couples who wanted to adopt them. And so the homes were in the process of brokering that relationship, sometimes in ways that were very questionable. Whoops.
The
Okay.
house of another chance.
It's very,
yeah.
Yeah. So here's another one. You see all these babies lined up, and I guess you can see at the time the idea was like, we are a source for couples who cannot have a child and are dying to become parents. We will help you, and that's a wonderful thing. But there's another way of looking at this, which is like, nobody was wondering where these babies came from. For every in this picture, there's a birth mother. Now, she may have wanted to give that baby up, but in many cases, they really were coerced and persuaded in ways that they did not have a lot of agency in making these decisions. So I actually find this really troubling to see that picture, and not more people wondered about, well, what is the source of all of these adoptable babies? It
reminds me of like a puppies for sale ad.
Yes, absolutely. Even worse and stranger is these exhibits where they would actually put the babies on display, and they would put them in a beautiful christening gown, and that's just very odd. This is an earlier one, I will say. I don't think this was going on into the 60s, because you can see from that man's clothing that it's more like 30s or 40s, but that is a very strange exhibit. I thought this article was interesting. It's a Christmas time piece featuring one of these homes, and mature sadness tempers the joy. So we have to always remember that this is a shameful thing. It has to be hidden away, even at Christmas time. you're opening your presents at home and having a lovely time, there's these girls in the Crittenden home where they can receive Christmas cards, but the names have to be blacked out because no one can know who their family is and where they came from. And whenever they show pictures of the women, they always show the back of them. They don't ever show anyone's face. So if you just think about how differently we think now about unplanned pregnancy and single motherhood and just sharing details of our personal lives, I mean, our culture has just really changed.
It really has.
Here, yeah. So here are some nuns caring for the babies, and this one looks staged too, but they seem nice. That seems like a nice, bright room. I think some of the, the conditions really varied from place to place. And this one, teenage unmarried mother-to-be trudges reluctantly and wearily up to the entrance of the Florence Crittenden home. And hopefully she will have a better sense of values, and when she's done. And so I just think it's very interesting to notice how the story of what these homes were for and who they were for and what they were intended to do and who they were intended to help and who they were not intended to help. It's interesting to pay attention because the way it was written about and talked about in popular culture really shaped the perception of those things. Because if you were going to, the goal was really to help the unwed mothers, you would probably design these homes differently. But clearly that wasn't the main goal. The main goal had to do with a lot of other, protecting a lot of other people's comfort. Also, you never see anything written about the father of these babies. So it's 100%, the woman that is carrying the consequences of what happened and being, shamed for not having good values. Of course, no one knows the story of this girl who's in this picture and why she's there. There could be lots of reasons for how she ended up in that situation, some of which were under her control and some of which were not. But there's just a real lack of curiosity about their experiences. One of the other things about the homes is that they had tutors that came in so that the girls could continue their education. They often learned skills and crafts that maybe they could use in a job, like they might have a typing class or something like that, because part of the goal was we want to erase this from your, permanent record, so to speak, and prepare you to become an adult and either take care of yourself or maybe someone will marry you, put you in a situation where you could meet a man who would marry you, but we can't have any, evidence that this happened to you because that would make it impossible for anyone to marry you. So they were really sort of being groomed and trained to go on to life that they would have after this. And this says they can go out, it's almost like they're prisoners. They have to sign out to go out to the movies. And some of them were over 18. They weren't all minors, but they were really heavily monitored. In some places, they weren't allowed to talk to the father of the baby. They weren't allowed to have a call with their boyfriend or anything like that. Their mail might have been restricted. So some of them were more strict, some of them were less strict, it just depended. This one, living quarters are very pleasant. And I just think that's funny because this picture doesn't look very pleasant to me. Here you have 3 beds in a row. Who knows how many beds are in that room? Right. And they're complete strangers. You're put in that room and you have no privacy. And for anyone who's ever been pregnant, it would be a very difficult situation. And they were also very unprepared for pregnancy and childbirth because they had not received good sex ed. They didn't know about their anatomy and how babies were born. There were stories in the oral histories of women who were in labor and did not understand how the baby was going to come out and what was going to be involved. So, I mean, it's hard to believe that. It's really, really hard to believe that that's true, but you have to put yourself in the headspace of these girls were coming up in a very repressed, sometimes very repressed, situation where they just had no information and they were not really given that information even in the months leading up to the birth.
Well, and I know that there's also like education as far as how they even became pregnant. Like some of them were unaware that was even a possibility for them.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, and is it right that some of these homes, like families would pay to send their child there? Is that correct?
Yeah, so they were all set up a little bit differently. Some of them, it was free, paid for by the diocese or whatever organization. Some of it was contingent, so you didn't have to pay anything as long as you gave your baby up. But if you tried to keep your baby, then they would send you a bill. And that was part of the coercion, that was used to get these girls to give up the babies. Because if you thought your parents couldn't afford to pay the bill, then you might say, okay, but then go on years later, or even very shortly thereafter, to really regret that decision. And it was also a violation of their legal rights because they weren't informed of, the options that were available to them. They didn't get to speak to a lawyer to fully consent to that decision. Anytime money is involved and anytime a big power differential is involved, it's not so simple to say, well, she knew she could have changed her mind. Well, there was a lot of pressure being exerted on them from all sides.
Yeah, and I think about even just the health repercussions about, you mentioned like, we can just wipe this clean. Well, I even think about having my children and how they're like, how was your first pregnancy? And all of the complications that come with that first pregnancy. And so that, for the future, and for her to maybe not be able to speak of that, that's
absolutely. And a lot of them, the standard of care, the maternity care was not very high. There were lots of stories of women who were treated poorly by the doctors because they were one of those girls. You were a girl who came to the hospital from the whatever home, and they gave you, they wouldn't give you a room. They'd put you in a broom closet. They wouldn't give you anesthesia because that was for married women only. I mean, all kinds of things that you just cannot even believe. And so a lot of them had permanent, damage and injuries from their birth experience that were never addressed. And they had long-term, issues from that. And then no follow-up care too. And we know that's a big part of maternity care, is that first 6 weeks of seeing your doctor and making sure that you've healed and everything is going the way it's supposed to. And everything was completely shoved under the rug and never spoken of again.
So I want to remind everyone, as we continue our conversation, if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to put them in the comments, or you can put them in the Q&A section as well. And we'll be sure to get those answered for you. Kelly, you can go ahead.
Yeah. And one thing I want to say too is that, I think part of why I called the book The Myth of Surrender is because there were and are a lot of myths around the story of adoption. And some of the myths from this time that were really powerful were that, that the girls they didn't care about their babies. They just wanted to get rid of them because it was an inconvenience and they were too young and they wanted to get back to having fun and being a teenager. And that might have been true, but it was also true that, the experience of pregnancy and giving birth was a very powerful emotional experience for them. And they didn't really always get to fully consent to the decision to surrender the child. But believing that they didn't want the babies is what made it easy for the people who brokered the adoptions and the adoptive parents to participate in the system, right? Because they were thinking, well, this baby would have been thrown in the trash if it wasn't for us, but it was obviously a lot more complicated than that. And then another myth is that, that those women just put it behind them and moved on. But one of the most profound things about reading the oral histories is that these are 70, 80-year-old women, and they say it was the most formative experience of their life. And this is something that happened when they were 16 or 18, and they never got over it. And it wasn't the adoption, it was the not knowing what happened to their child, not knowing if their child was alive or dead, not knowing if their child blamed them for bad things that happened to them or felt rejected, and just they absolutely, haunted by that. So it was such a myth that you could just pretend it never happened and that would not have an effect on your life. It had a huge effect, and it had a huge effect on how those women then parented, other children that they might have gone on to have later. Some of them never told if they got married, they might not have told their husband that they went through that experience. And a lot of people have found each other through, in the last like 10 years, through 23andMe. You've probably heard a story of someone who found a sibling that they didn't know about, or a half sibling. Some of those cases are involving these maternity home adoptions. So that's very interesting too. There's so much to talk about.
I know.
Yeah, I could go on and on. And I want to hear people's questions too. I'm just trying to see this.
We
This is
had
the
someone
second
that
to
just
last.
mentioned
Yeah,
that the charity organizations obviously did very well financially during this period, which
yeah. It's hard to pin down. Like, there were egregious cases. Some people have probably seen some of the documentaries about the homes that were actually selling babies, where it was like very upfront. This is the price you pay. You get a white baby with blue eyes or whatever. That was probably more rare. I think more common was the sort of like understanding that the family would make a donation to the diocese or something like that. And so it wasn't like a direct payment, but they would benefit financially. Yeah. And there's more work that needs to be done researching that, because that was one of the hardest things to sort of pin down and understand. And I will say that I had to sort of guess in some cases, or just sort of work around that, because I wasn't able to find, hard evidence. But I think it kind of ran the gamut from all out, black market sales of babies to more kind of squishy stuff.
yeah, for sure.
And then the last thing I'll show on here, and then I'd love to hear more questions. We talked a little bit about, lack of understanding of how they got pregnant in the first place, because they might not have had access to good sex ed. There obviously was no access to birth control, or even understanding of how to use birth control. But one of the common themes in these articles is this hand wringing of the people in charge of these homes and these organizations of, we just can't figure out, how do these girls keep getting into trouble? Why are there so many pregnant teenagers? Because there was a huge increase in teen pregnancy during this time. One of the reasons is because people had cars. This was like, 1950s was the first era that maybe a teenage boy would have a car. Before the war, that wouldn't have been true. So it was like a place to go. So
Yeah,
that actually was a big factor. You weren't
those
like
darn cars.
Right, the back seat of the car. But it's just interesting again. And when you think about how the story is being framed here, it's like, this is such a complicated problem that we don't know how to solve, when of course the solution is, empowering young women with information about their bodies, educating boys as well, and holding boys responsible for, the consequences of their actions. So I just find that humorous that it's so complex. We just can't get to the bottom of it. And this one, the case of the unwed mother, we need a detective here. How are we going to figure out what's happening?
Let's get Lieutenant Colonel Daniel on that case.
Yes, and he would have been a colonel in the Salvation Army. That's the titles that they used. And then you have another, silhouette, because we can't ever see the face of a woman who was in this place. So those are all my pictures to show my little report. But I would love to hear any questions or comments or experiences, if anybody has any that they want to share.
Yes, friends, please feel free to put those in the chat, or put them in the Q&A as well. If you'd like to keep them more anonymous, we can do it that way as well. So let's talk about the book a little bit. So how did you go about developing your characters? You talked a little bit about maybe one of the stories rang true for you, but is there anything else that helped you in their character development?
Yeah, I knew that, it's kind of a classic oil and water kind of, friendship, in the sense that they come from two different places. They don't have much in common. They probably would not have become friends if they weren't in this situation. I wanted one of them, who's my character, Margie, to be from the suburbs and from a really, sheltered, closed kind of upbringing. And she was more introverted. And in my mind, she really wanted to stay in school, and she really loved studying literature. And this, puts that future college experience at risk. And then I wanted to have, and she would be the one that you would understand. It would be so hard for her to speak up, to advocate for herself, because that was just the kind of personality that she had. But then I didn't want, that wasn't what they were all like. I mean, there were girls who were much more outspoken and who were able to stand up for what they wanted. And so I wanted to sort of represent that as well. So then my other character is Doreen, and she is from Chicago, and she is from Taylor Street, which is Little Italy, and an immigrant family, and her father has died. So, they don't have very much money. And she actually chooses to go to the home against her mother's wishes, because she knows that she's going to be having a biracial baby. And so she is afraid about what that is going to do in her community. And also she has a dream for her future that does not involve becoming a teen mom. And so, they both have their vision of what they think is going to happen. And then of course, things get a little bit, go a little differently than they expect.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee. They said, Kelly, I've read all of your books and I've enjoyed every single one. How long did it take you to write this one?
Thank you so much. That is commitment. I appreciate that very much. It's hard to say, because with the pandemic too, it was like such a crazy process, but I would say it's about 4 years since I started working on the idea. And I took, probably the first year was drafting and sort of figuring out the story and doing some research. And then there was sort of a break in there. And then I did some other stuff and came back to it and revised. And then took another break. And so it wasn't like 4 years of continuously working on it, but it took the whole thing. But you need those breaks too, because the breaks are the times where you sort of figure out some of the problems that are stopping you from moving it forward. So that's just sort of you can't rush the process.
We have a question from William. Seems like there would be a lot of sadness that you uncovered in your research and writing. How did you handle that? Did you need to take any breaks? And also, by the way, Island of Doves has been my favorite so far.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. Thank you. Absolutely. Yes. About the sadness. It was devastating. And especially, I have a daughter who's 10, and having had her and imagining putting myself in the shoes of those young women, I just cannot, it's just a nightmare to imagine your baby being taken from you. For most of us, that's not something that would happen, but that actually did happen to these girls. I did have to take breaks, and there were certain scenes that were very hard to write and that were really emotional to write. And even now, like even thinking about them, I'm getting teared up, because you do really feel plugged in, to the experience. You spend a lot of time with these imaginary people in your head, and it's very meaningful to tell the story and find a way to give them a resolution. It's not a perfect ending, but at least find a way to help them overcome some of it or move forward somehow with hope, for their future. But it is, you go all the way down with them into the worst parts. And that's just part of the job.
We have a question from Kate. It looks like the women came to the homes about the 4 months prior to birth. How long after the birth were they allowed to stay? Were they allowed to recuperate?
Oh, good question. That varied a lot, and it depended. Like in some years, there was such high demand because there were so many pregnant girls and not enough beds that they actually would get sent away to a private home of a person, like a wealthier person who volunteered, had an extra bedroom, volunteered to let the girl come in, stay in their home, and usually work as a housekeeper or take care of children until right before their due date, maybe like a few weeks before, and then they would go to the maternity home. So that was a different kind of experience, which I don't really depict, but that was super common in years when the demand was really high. I would say probably 4 months is like the earliest they would have come, and then it sort of varied. And then it depended, but they did not stay very long. And the baby would be immediately separated at the time of birth. So they wouldn't even see the baby. And then, I think maybe a few days or to a week of recovery, unless there was complications or whatever. But yeah, and then their parents just picked them up and took them home. And a lot of the stories that I read, they said, we didn't even talk about it in the car. Nobody acknowledged what had even happened. And they never asked, how are you feeling? And not to get into too much detail, but following a birth, there are a lot of physical symptoms that women experience as they're recovering. And so those all had to be hidden away too. And if you've been through that yourself, you can imagine how that would go, because you wouldn't even necessarily be in contact with a doctor that you could call or a nurse that you could ask questions about. So it was pretty terrible.
Very traumatic for sure, especially for a young person that doesn't even understand what's going on. I can't even imagine. David says the paragraph where Margie is surprised by Doreen having an unexpected depth was brilliant. As was the mystery of another girl being able to eat while chewing gum.
Thank you, David. I love it. Thank you for your careful read. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. I have one more question for you, and then if there are no more questions, we'll close it out. But so what's next for you? Are you working on anything else?
I will be honest with you that I'm in a little bit of a in-between period. I'm still thinking about what I want to work on next. I think all of us, whatever profession you are in, coming out of the last couple of years, we're all pretty frazzled. And I've been just really, I have a day job, a full-time job as well. So there's a lot of just not enough hours in the day to do all of the things. But I feel like my bandwidth for doing more things is less than it used to be before the pandemic. Yeah, I mean, everybody is feeling that. So if you're a writer, if anyone out there is a writer, I mean, I think people always talk about the discipline that you have to be successful as a writer. And that's true. And that you have to write every day. And some people find that is very important to keep going a little bit every day. And that can be true, but I think people don't talk enough about how sometimes you just need time away, and that's how you fill the well for new ideas. You need to just be around really great stories and read other people's work that you find inspiring, and trust, that you're going to find that next idea when the time is right.
I agree with that. We're going to end this on the most adorable note I've ever had to give someone. Your brother Matthew says, tell my sister I'm very proud of her.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Oh, appreciate it.
All right. Kelly, thank you so much for hanging out with me this evening. Thank you everyone that has been asking questions and has attended this evening. If you haven't purchased a copy of The Myth of Surrender, you can do through schulerbooks.com or nicholasbooks.com as well. Thanks again, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Thanks to everyone for coming out. I hope I get to see you in real life at a real book event for the paperback.
Absolutely. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.